Okay, good morning and welcome to today's Local Pension Committee meeting. As usual, this meeting is being broadcast live to the public. For those not able to watch live, the webcast will be recorded and made available for viewing on the County Council website after the meeting. Before we can begin, can I just remind you to turn on your microphones when you're speaking, turn them off when you've finished, and probably the worst offender on that is me. This morning I've received apologies from Mr. King and Mr. Booth. I welcome Mr. Dan Harrison, who is attending as a substitute for Mr. King. Just before we start, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank those local pension committee members who are no longer on the committee, namely Councillor Adam Clark and Councillor Melissa March. We thank them for their time on the committee. I would also like to extend a warm welcome to Councillor Jeff Whittle from Leicester City Council, who is now a member of the committee. Welcome, Jeff. Now on to the main items. With the committee's approval, what I want to do, because I know there are some people who've got to leave early, we will take item 8 first, 7, 11 and 15, and then move on to the remaining items. Is that agreed? Thank you. All right, so the first item is, if I can sort myself out, the first item is item 8, which is the funding risk update and 2025 valuation funding report on pages 61 to 96 of the agenda. Bhulesh is presenting the report. So over to you, Bhulesh.
Thank you, Chair. I'll be brief because we still have a presentation for this part of the agenda as well. So the purpose of the report is to provide the committee with an update on the changes on the funding level since the 2022 valuation and the risks currently faced by the fund. The fund is required to complete a valuation every 3 years. As you've heard, the purpose of the valuation is to check the ongoing solvency of the scheme assets held versus the liabilities and to set employer contribution rates for the following 3 years by employers. The valuation will be completed by the 31st of March 2026, with new employer contribution rates being certified for the period starting the 1st of April 2026 all the way through to the 31st of March 2029. And just before I hand over to Richard or Tom, I'll remind you that as at the 31st of March 2022, and I think we heard this earlier, the funding level was 105%.
Bhulesh, thank you, Chair. Okay, I think to assist what we're talking about here, I believe we'll share the annex to the report, just to maybe have some of the visual aids to describe what we're talking about. But just to reiterate the point that Bhulesh made, the headline today, the funding update, and if the valuation was today or at the 30th of June with the set of assumptions that we carried forward from the last valuation, we're hearing that the funding level would be 150% funded. Okay, that is the headline. That is on the face of it good news. The point of coming to the committee today and to talk about the funding level, and in particular to talk about some of the risks and what's happened in the environment since the last valuation, is to urge a little bit of caution and create a wider understanding of what's actually going on underneath the bonnet of that funding level. So we hear that we're 150% funded. Some of the headlines as to how we've actually got there in the past couple of years, there's been some significant changes in the environment, the economic environment. So just first of all, looking at investment returns. So the biggest change and the reason why the pension fund find themselves in this 150% funded position is interest rates have risen to they've risen up to 5.25% at the end of June. They've actually come down slightly since then. And in a high interest rate environment, it generally follows that there's an expectation that the investments held by the pension fund will achieve a higher rate of return. Okay, now a higher rate of future return is of course good news for the pension fund. And if we can assume a higher rate of return, then that means that we actually say, well, okay, we need to hold less money today to pay for all the pensions. And that is why we say that we're 150% funded. And the page that we're on here, which is in the annex report, the actual graph on the right hand side shows that for every asset class, whether it be bonds and cash and safer assets, or equities and overseas equities, properties, higher riskier assets. The expectation is that all of these assets will achieve a higher rate of return than what they would have at March 22. That is, of course, just an assumption, and it's predicated on this high interest rate environment. It may not play out in the future, so that's immediately something to be cautious about. Something else that's happened then, just to skip on to the next page of the report, is inflation. It's probably not lost on anyone that over the past couple of years, inflation has been high. And as the graph on the right-hand side shows, the green spike in particular is CPI inflation. Okay, and there was 2 years of particularly high inflation. Okay, it was all over the media. And for the pension fund, what that means is that all of the pensioners and also the deferred pensioners, people that will be pensioners in the future, all of their benefits have increased significantly. Okay, over this 2 year period, their benefits have increased by around 15% or over 15% when you compound those two increases. In isolation, that would have negatively impacted the funding level. The funding level would have actually gone down. Okay, so high inflation was a bad thing for the pension fund. However, that has been more than swamped by this high interest rate environment and this idea that we think we're going to get much better return on our assets. The other thing to note is just in the picture, the orange line is core CPI. Okay, now core CPI strips out some of the more volatile aspects of CPI, the CPI index, things like the energy pricing, things like that. So core CPI, a lot of market commentators would say that core CPI is actually a better indicator of CPI trends. And core CPI still remains a little bit higher than the Bank of England target of 2%. There is also a lot of commentary out there in the market that suggests that CPI will actually go back up again in the later part of this year. There's a number of other global and political uncertainties that can, of course, affect inflation, things such as the US election and other geopolitical things that are going on. So the point with inflation is it's come back down. Okay, that doesn't mean it's going to stay there, and it remains an uncertainty, and it remains something that the pension fund need to keep an eye on and be cautious around. So that's some of the headlines around what's happened. The biggest point of the paper and why we're here talking to committee is to talk about some of the risks and talk about the preparation heading into the valuation. So just skipping ahead, some of the people that were at the training today, we've talked about some of the risks out there. The funding level, I won't dwell on this. This is quite a complicated graph. And the blue line is the funding level. We can see that's tracked upwards to around 150%. Under the bonnet, it's made up of two component items. The green line is the assets. So we heard this morning that assets have remained relatively stable since the last valuation. They've gone up a little bit in the last couple of quarters, but give or take, assets have performed roughly as expected. So why are we so well funded? Well, the answer to that question is that it is the pink line. Okay, the liabilities, the value that the actuaries, myself and Richard, place on the benefits that are due to be paid in the future has come down significantly. The reason that we can say that the liabilities are now, they've come down, the pensions are now cheaper, is because we think we're going to get better returns in the future. Okay, now that is still, that's our best guess. It's the best guess based on the economic climate and all of the models that we have. But of course, it is still predicated on this idea that we're going to get more returns in the future. That is no certainty. Okay, and it is absolutely still a reason to be cautious. So just moving on then to a couple of the risks. Again, this is a relatively complicated picture, but what I want to say about the picture is that the green line represents the funding level at the last valuation, and you can be anywhere on the green line with a degree of certainty, and the degree of certainty is based on how much return you think you're going to get and how certain you think you're going to get that return. And then the same equivalent idea you can apply to the blue line. Now, the point of this, and this is the thing I said a second ago, the blue and green lines are on top of each other. Okay, so what that means is that we're roughly holding the same amount of assets per pound of pension that we did at March 22. So in isolation, we're not in any better position than we were at the last valuation. We're actually in exactly the same position as we were at the last valuation. The only thing that's changed is that it's much, or we think it's going to be much easier to get 4% or 6% or whatever, wherever you want to pick the investment return on this graph. We think it's going to be easier now to get that return than what it would have been at March 22. And okay, you might say that's an assumption. I've talked a lot about risk and managing risk and saying we've got to be cautious. But look, if you took all your money and put it in the bank, and the level of return you get on cash, or if you go and buy a bunch of government bonds, you could almost guarantee that return. So it is okay to say, yes, it is okay to sit here and say we think we can be more certain about getting that return. But the fact is, you're not just invested in bonds, you're invested in riskier assets, you've got equities and things. These things are volatile, they can go up and down. So there's no certainty that you'll get these returns. We are pretty much where we were last time. Okay, so absolutely reason to be cautious, particularly if the high interest rate environment that we're in just now doesn't maintain for as long a period as maybe what it might be predicted. So moving on then, this is just to show you some of the riskier employers. We didn't talk about this morning. This is maybe quite an interesting one because some of the fund's made up of a collection of 200 or 300 individual employers, okay, and the funding level of the fund is the aggregate of these positions. Under the bonnet, you'll have different employers that will have different funding levels. The dots on this graph just represent some of what we might perceive to be riskier employers, and riskier employers are those that don't have a tax backing or don't have a guarantor that stands behind them in the fund. So if they were to exit the fund, they would have a deficit to pay, and once they paid that, they're absolved of all responsibility to the fund, which then leaves this legacy position which falls on the rest of the fund and the rest of the employers. It is a useful thing to be able to track them and monitor them and understand what that position is. In aggregate, they are all now roughly above 100% funded, okay, for the same reasons that we've talked about at the global level. So that's good news, but again, it's something that the officers and ourselves, we will continue to keep an eye on and maybe report to the committee if things change in the future. Just on the same slide, sorry, just before we move on, headline for one of the biggest stakeholders in the pension fund, of course, is employers. We've got employers reps on the committee. The big question that everyone's going to be asking, not just within this fund, across the LGPS, is what does this mean for employer contributions? At face value, if a pension fund says it's 150% funded, the expectation might be for employer contribution reductions. Now, that is absolutely going to be a consideration of the officers and ourselves and the committee. It will be one of a number of considerations. It's not the sole consideration, and it needs to be balanced against things like the investment risk, inflation risk, other risks such as climate risks, and other uncertainties out there. Pension funding is absolutely a long-term game. The assumptions are set with the long term in mind. Even from the employer's perspective, it is to their benefit to look at things over the long term. It is not beneficial for an employer to pay 30% at one valuation and then 10% the next valuation, and then ask them to suddenly put the hand in the pocket at the subsequent one, and that's very difficult. So slow and steady and gradual reductions, if there is any reductions, would be the order of business here that we'd be proposing. So moving on, just to very quickly talk about some of the key risks. Longevity risk always is a risk to pension funds. One of the biggest risks to pension fund is that pensioners live longer. Of course, that's good news for pensioners. We're not saying that we don't want that, but what we're saying is we need to try and get a handle on these things. We need to try and understand what that risk is. Now, predicting life expectancy and predicting longevity is probably a little bit harder today than what it has been in the past, and the big reason for that is the pandemic. And the picture on the screen just shows that there's been some pretty discernible trends over the recent couple of decades. But now that we enter into the pandemic and then the post-pandemic era, it is a little bit harder to say what the kind of long-term trend is likely to be. There's a lot of reasons why you might say it actually might be beneficial, or it might be worse. It's probably still too soon to say. So it's a risk, and we constantly manage all these risks. So moving on, from longevity risk, climate risk is absolutely a very topical risk for this pension fund and committee, and for all pension funds across the UK. Climate risk is a very hard thing to quantify. It's probably more appropriate to talk about it from an investment perspective, and from the pension fund, you've got your own climate pledges and climate policies and targets. And I'm sure that the investment advisors and officers come to you regularly to talk about these things from a climate risk perspective. From a funding perspective, all we can probably do is just lean into those same, that same analysis that's getting done on the investment side, and just to quantify that this is a credible risk for the funding level. And the picture just shows that we've done some analysis of some extreme events and what these might be, and it's an evolving science and climate risk. Now, what we do and what we're going to bring back to this committee when we actually talk about it with specifics is we're going to carry out modelling and look at what we call extreme events cascading its way through the financial markets. Now, one of those things that we've modelled and that we will bring back, it's just an example of a number of things that could happen. One of them is this idea of a global food shock, okay, and how a global food shock could then work its way through the various markets and then eventually impact investment returns. It could impact inflation. It would then impact funding levels. Okay, now there's more to climate risk than just global food shock. This is one of a number of examples. And the point is that the pension fund needs to be alive to this as a risk. How you then accommodate it into your funding strategies may be a little bit harder. It might just be as simple as leaving a little bit of a funding cushion, okay, for shocks such as climate risk. Another type of shock might be an investment shock to investment markets. Okay, these are all reasons to maybe leave a little bit spare in the funding level to mean that if this did materialise, then you're not immediately going to employers and asking them to increase contributions. There'll be more to come on climate risk. I won't dwell on that. And there's lots of content in the paper. I'm just sort of skipping through this. Employer covenant, yes, when the pension fund's well funded, it maybe feels like employer covenant is less of a concern. It should absolutely still continue to be one of the pillars of an integrated risk management framework. You look at investments, you look at funding, and you look at covenant. Okay, and we talked a little bit about the riskier employers. We'll continue to look at them and look at how that risk features. And a number of the reasons why the pension fund is actually well funded are negatives for employers. High interest rates might be negative if they've got big levels of borrowing. High inflation, high wage bills. These are all things that we're saying, okay, the pension fund's in a good position. These are negatively impacting employers. Okay, so we continue to look at this. We continue to monitor it, and we build it into the broader funding strategy. So then, just what does that mean? So what we're going to bring back to committee. So we heard this morning the position that we leave ourselves in heading into the valuation. The preparation has already begun, and we're looking at 4 options of how we manage whether or not you call it manage the surplus or just generally manage the pension fund and manage the risk. At every valuation, we're looking at employer contributions. We're also looking at investment strategy. One of the things that we might do, we've heard a little bit today about some of the uncertainty that lives out there. And one of the reactions that the pension fund could do, particularly while it's well funded, would be to increase level of prudence. Just for broader context on prudence, there's no right or wrong answer. Okay, but across the LGPS, most funds typically find themselves somewhere between 70 and 80%. Okay, now pension funds is a regulatory requirement to be prudent. Okay, you can't be sort of 50-50 best estimate. We're talking about paying people's pensions in the future. So this regulatory requirement to be prudent, set prudent funding plans. How prudent is prudent? Okay, it's a little bit arbitrary, a little bit finger in the air, but typically, like say, somewhere between 70 and 80%. The market has shifted to be closer maybe to 75 to 80%, and that's a little bit of a shift in reaction to some of the things we've heard about today. You're able to put a little bit away for a rainy day, so that might be a decision that we come back to the committee next time and say we're at 75%. We would maybe encourage the committee to act on that and move up to 80. Okay, that might be a decision at a future committee just to set the scene there. And the final thing is this surplus retention. The fund's a little bit of a trailblazer in this space. A number of funds in the Scottish valuation up in Scotland has gone through 2023, and that was after a lot of these things we've heard about today had already materialised. So they were looking at big funding levels, and one of the actions that a lot of the Scottish funds took was to set a kind of buffer to protect themselves, insulate against some of these future risks, such as climate risk and investment risk and higher inflation, some of these uncertainties. To have a kind of buffer at 120% at the last valuation. I would expect that we will maintain that buffer. I'm not going to say that we're making a decision on that today. Same as the level of prudence, we're setting the scene. Probably at the next committee, we will come back and we will ask you to sign off on funding principles, such as maintaining this kind of surplus buffer. So that's going to come back. These are some of the big decisions that we're going to bring back to the committee. Today is very much just about warming the committee up to what's going on out there. And just finally, in the paper, there's some stuff in here, some extra detail about what that might mean and some of the decisions. I won't go through that. You've maybe read it already, or you can read it at your leisure. So welcome any questions. We've had a bit of training this morning and some really good questions on that, but welcome anything else from anyone at the committee today.
Thanks very much, Tom and Richard. Right, Mr. Cartwright.
Thank you. I mean, March 25 to 28, the next cycle, for want of a better word. There's some stuff we know and some stuff we don't know. So what we do know is in April 28, so literally a month after the next cycle, pension ages, the minimum age you'll be able to draw down will be going from 55 to 58. That's a major factor that has to be considered during this cycle because it immediately kicks in the next cycle. What we don't know is the talk about the pension age changing from 67 to 68, which is being mooted at the moment. So there is what we know and what we don't know. How does those two scenarios feed into this?
It's with any of these, any regulatory changes or changes at a government level that affect pension. When we set assumptions, that the key things are how much of the pension is going to be, okay, which things like inflation, but then another big one is when are they going to be, okay, when are they going to be and for how long. So the question you're asking is that one about when are they going to be, okay, will they draw them down at 55 or is that now going to be 57 at the earliest? Are people going to retire the state pension age at 67? It is actually going to go up to 68 at some point in the future. So these are all things when these are crystallized, when legislation is passed for these to be the assumption that then we build them into our models. A lot of these are already built in. The latest one being that change from when you can take early retirement from 55 to 57. We'll be building these all into our models. My guess is it won't make that big an impact, because we've already predicted a number of these things. And also on the point around people taking pension early, if they take it early, then they actually get a reduction to their pension. So it ends up being sort of broadly neutral from a pension funding point of view.
Okay, thanks very much. Has anybody else got any other questions? Oh, right, Clive.
Thank you, Chair. Very interesting. Just in the spirit of fairness, I noticed you're looking at the employer contributions. Can you look at the employee contributions? I think that's a fair point to make.
It's a fair point. It's not something we can affect, unfortunately. It's set in statutory, it's legislation. So the employee contributions are purely based on how much an employee earns, and there's different. I think there's sort of 7 or 8 brackets, which would then dictate what the employee contribution would be. I think it starts at 5.5%.
Yeah.
And for the really high earners, it goes all the way up to, I think it's 10 or 11%, isn't it?
Maybe 12
Yeah.
November. Yeah, but it's set in stone. You can't.
Right. So the employer contributions are not set statutorily.
We call this a balance of cost scheme, and by that we mean that if you've got surplus, via the employer's benefit, because they're ultimately the people who sponsor the benefits, who provide the cash, and if there's a deficit, equally they have to stump up the money needed to fund the deficit. But all through that, the employee contributions stay fixed under regulations, so the fund can't do anything about that, and it just depends on your earnings. If you earn more, you pay a higher percentage you pay towards your benefits, but they're fixed under regulations. So unless those regulations change, you're kind of stuck with whatever the structure is.
I might make the point that's sort of manifestly unfair.
Well, employers might say, but the balance we have to pay in the bad times we have to stump up, in the good times we get some back. So it depends which perspective you take.
It's the same for every fund as well. It's probably worth saying. It's Bulish's point.
Yeah, an interesting point, but as you said, it's fixed in statute. Yeah.
So I want to ask around that funding model. You showed the slide around climate risk. Is that taken into the general sort of funding levels that we are now, or because all of those ones are pointing downwards, weren't they? Regardless of whether it's a good scenario or a bad scenario. Yeah. So is that taken into the main funding level sort of model?
Yeah. So it's a really good question. I'm aware that I didn't want to monopolise the committee's time today talking about climate risk, so I probably didn't give it enough time. Look, I mean, we could talk all day about climate risk, so I do welcome this question. So a couple of things I would say about climate risk. So first of all, when we set funding levels, so when we're talking about 150% funding, we've set that with respect to an expectation of future return. That expectation of future return is based on a 75% chance of getting those returns. Okay, so that model that we predict these future returns, what we actually do is we run 5,000 different simulations of future economic outcomes. Okay, and within those 5,000 projections, it then allows you to kind of distill it down to, okay, 3/4 of them, that the investment return was good enough. So that's how we end up at 75%. In the other 25%, there is all manner of sins in there that would lead to disappointing investment returns. One of them could be, a black swan event such as the 2008 crash. One of them could be some sort of catastrophic climate risk event. So effectively, they're already in the model. Okay, they're already in there, and the aggregate of that is that we've got this funding level. But the point around climate risk, or the point around any of that other, 25%, we're talking about downside risk here. So when we set the funding plan, I talked about prudence, 75, maybe it's 80. Even if we move it up to 80, we're still not capturing the downside risk. Okay, now you're not going to set up your funding plan based on the expectation of the worst case scenario, but it is also very important to be alive to the fact that there is this worst case scenario out there. And it also means we know that pension funds and committees are very engaged on climate risk. And if a pension committee was so minded to attach a higher degree of worry to climate risk, then they might say, okay, we know it's in there, we know it's in the model, but we actually believe that climate risk is even more credible a threat to the pension fund than maybe what these modelling projections suggest. And you might then choose to just take an extra chunk of prudence or something like that to manage that. Okay, but isn't it that the picture, just to explain the other part of your question, the picture that we showed in the graph, what that does is that's specifically focusing on the downside risk. And some of the modelling that will come back, and we might actually, we're talking to the guys today about potentially coming to committee and doing a climate workshop specifically around all of this. And we've got guys, climate specialists in our department that will come and bring loads of interest and detail around what they model. And with downside risk, one of them is that idea that talk about a global food shock, and there's other things. And the idea is that it could absolutely have a huge impact on the funding level. But to an extent, it's already in there. It's just adding a bit of credibility to one particular scenario.
Right, yeah. Thanks, that was great.
Thanks very much, Tom. Has anybody else got any questions? Oh,
yeah, just a quick one. You talked about all the investment classes being positive and going to go forward because of interest rates. Surely long-dated bonds will lose their own value if interest rates rise. So I'm not sure that particular class is as attractive as you seem to paint the picture.
So this is a really good question. It's also it's an interesting question between the yield. When we talk about yields, we're looking at future yields, aren't we? And of course, the question, and it's an entirely valid point, anything that you currently hold, effectively loses value. Okay, but you lose that off the value of your assets, whereas the future yield still remains. So yes, there'd be an expectation that your asset might go down. So there's a little bit of kind of give and take, but and it's not as easy as us just setting an assumption and saying that this is what you'll get, because there's the timing of when you move in and out of asset classes, and there's if you've got a long dated bond, when's that coming up for maturity and all these things. So absolutely a valid point, far too complicated to necessarily build into your model. And I think Bullish might have some comments around this at one of the offices around that there'll be a spread. You're not just invested in a number of bonds that all mature at the same point in time. So it'll be a gradual thing with the investment mandates.
Bullish, you want to say?
Yeah, we do. We have some long dated bonds. By no means do we have a huge allocation to. So we have a portfolio of index-linked bonds, which are a bit more insulated, only makes up about 3.5% of the portfolio. We have a smaller proportion within investment-grade bonds, but again, they're not very long dated. So although we do have some exposure, it's not as high as some funds may have within the LGPS.
Thank you. Good point. Returning to par value. So if no one else has any questions, then the committee's asked to note the report. Is that agreed? Now, before we go and on to the next item, which is the Quimbrook presentation, I'll just run through some housekeeping items. Item 1 is the minutes of the meeting held on the 19th of June 2024. I propose that the minutes of the meeting held on the 8th of March 2024 are taken on the 19th of June are taken as read, confirmed and signed. Is that agreed? Agreed, thank you. Item 2, I've received no questions. Item 3, questions asked by members under Standing Order 7.3 and 7.5. I've received no questions. to advise of any items which the chairman has decided to take as urgent elsewhere on the agenda. I've not been notified of any urgent items. And finally, the most important one, declaration of interest in respect of any items on the agenda. Do any members have any interest they wish to declare? No? Okay, thanks very much. So we're now on to the presentation by Quinbrook. We welcome Mark Burrows, Rosaline Smith-Maxwell, and James Forsyth from Quinbrook Quinbrook Infrastructure Partners, who will deliver a presentation on the item. But before that, we have Bhulesh, who is going to introduce the report. So Bhulesh, over to you.
Thank you, Chair. So the purpose is to provide information on the fund's infrastructure investments held with Quinbrook Infrastructure Partners. A bit of background on the fund's infrastructure allocation. So Hymans, as you know, our investment advisor, completed the 2024 strategic asset allocation review as part of the fund's annual review in January 2024. As part of that review, the allocation to infrastructure remained at 12.5% of fund assets. At point 4, we have a table there, and it shows the fund has an infrastructure allocation managed by 7 managers. Quinbrook are one of those managers. The table there shows at the top, the top 3 show 3 open mandates, one with JP Morgan, one with IFM, and one with LGPS Central. And then we have 4 closed mandates. So these are the ones where we invest and we don't have much liquidity, and we've got to wait until the end of the investment to return our capital. Quinbrook are one of those managers. We invested in something called the Net Zero Power Fund, which we'll hear more about in a moment. At the July 2022 and April 2023 meetings of the investment subcommittee, a total amount of $104 million was allocated to 2 products with Quinbrook, a Net Zero Power Fund and a co-investment fund. I'm sure the team here will inform us of the differences. And at point 7 here shows what the presentation will cover. So point 7A to 7D. Hand over.
Over to you.
Thank you so much for having us, Chair, councillors, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to be here today. And also thank you for your support with our with your investments with Quinbrook as well. My name is Mark Burrows. I'm one of the managing directors at Quinbrook and head of capital formation for Europe. I'm joined with 2 of my colleagues here, Rosaline Smith-Maxwell and James Forsyth from the investment team. So thank you for having us. In relation to today's presentation, we're going to just give you a little reminder as to who Quinbrook is. We're going to touch on the fund strategy itself. We're going to talk about the valuation of the fund and the performance to the extent that we can. We're then going to touch on some case studies within the portfolio and the markets as well into which we're invested. The key thematic of sustainability will run right throughout the presentation from a Quinbrook perspective to a investment perspective as well. Obviously, we welcome questions, you know, as and when they may be suitable with the chair. So
that's great, thank you.
So turning to slide number 2 now, if we may. I think probably the main message that we can take from this slide is the longevity of Quinbrook's experience and the experience of the senior investment team in the renewables and low carbon space. It actually dates back to 1998. So we've experienced, you know, various market cycles, legislation changes, and our core experience is in the 3 geographies of the United States, the United Kingdom and Australia. And the fund vehicle that you're invested into very much focuses on those 3 markets. Our key differentiator really from an energy transition perspective is, yes, we invest in renewable energy generation. Yes, we invest in battery storage alongside renewable energy generation. But with a lot of intermittent energy, you know, that creates problems for the grid. And so the grid needs to be built out in order to cater for that. So a large part of the way that Quinbrook sees the market is focusing on a holistic approach to the energy transition market, because there's lots of different parts to it which is developing, but actually also there's multiple different areas of value to be captured as well. And it's through that lens that we'll be offering this presentation today. If we could move on now to slide number 3, please. You can see here the size of the fund, which is $3 billion US. Bhulesh kindly introduced the concept of a fund investment versus a co-investment. Essentially, there's $2 billion has been raised for the fund investment and $1 billion for the co-investment. Any more details need to be provided. We're happy to do that, but to all intents and purposes, they're investing in the same transactions. Again, it's the US, the UK, and Australia. The good thing about this fund is the amount of money that has been drawn down, the amount of investments that have already been made. We're about 64% drawn down from a fund perspective. The fund only closed, earlier this month. That capital has been invested into 5 platforms, 3 of which are in the United States, 1 of which is in the United Kingdom, and 1 of which is in Australia. Again, it's generation. So there's a business in there called Primergy, which is solar plus battery storage. There's a business called Rowan, which is the decarbonisation of the data center market, which is a fascinating market. We're going to dive into that in a little bit. A business called Purpose Energy, which is it's a biofuels business based in the United States. A grid support set of assets in the United Kingdom, and a data center business with some batteries in Australia as well. So we'll be hugely excited to share some of the information on these projects with you. One thing I would say as we move on to the next slide as well is these businesses and these investments that we've made are in line with our long track record in the space, which, as I said, dates back to 1998. So it's consistent with prior strategies and return targets. Given we're in a public forum here, we haven't put up the exact performance. I think what we can say is that, and obviously you have access to the reports as well separately, all valuations have been heading upwards. They're all heading in the right direction. We're very pleased with how we are performing. Number of jobs have been and will continue to be created from a sustainability perspective, and the platforms are being constructed, the assets are being constructed, and as the assets move from construction into operational, you'll see natural value uplifts as well, in line with standard valuation policy.
Just a quick one. Are you specifically looking at those 3 areas for your investment, or if something came up in, say, New Zealand, are you still open-minded to spread into the different platforms?
We focus on those 3 countries. We do have a potential to invest 10% into other OECD countries, but frankly, our experiences within those 3 markets, that's where we think we can get the returns that we're targeting and where we understand the risk the best. So it's incredibly unlikely we'll go beyond those 3. Moving on now to slide number 5. These are 3 particular transactions that we thought you would find interesting, or developments within these investments that we thought you'd find interesting. From one is a first of a kind, one is the largest, and one has a very significant effect on valuations. Primergy is our US business investing into solar and batteries. There's a very significant financing that's taken place there. I think it's first of a kind, which essentially means we can start building the project a lot sooner. We can disclose there that that's got a long-term power purchase agreement with Microsoft. So it's a very significant counterparty, which of course increases value to the business itself. Rowan is our business, which is investing in the decarbonisation of data centres and siting data centres. We've mentioned there a long-term lease. One of the key value drivers behind any of these assets is securing long-term leases or long-term offtake contracts with significant counterparties. We've done that here with one of the hyperscalers. The hyperscalers are, Google, Meta, Microsoft, Amazon. So it's one of the big names. And we're in the process of securing 2 more leases, which we hope will be signed off in the next sort of 2 to 4 weeks. And so assuming that goes according to plan, which we think it will, you will see another value uplift. Supernode, and I'll rattle through this one, it's going to be one of the largest battery storage sites in Queensland, in Australia. It's also a fantastic place to locate a data center. it's just outside Brisbane. Sydney and Melbourne are both saturated from a data center perspective. Brisbane is not. The great advantage that Brisbane has is its connectivity to the rest of the Western world through undersea cables, which when we're talking about geopolitical shifts potentially from China as well, that's a very useful place to have a data center. So I will pause there and finish my presentation, and I will hand over to my colleagues. Thank you.
Hi, James Forsyth, associate in the investment team. So Mark's already mentioned it, but we have a data center strategy in the US. The portfolio company is called Rowan, and this slide on slide 6 is a case study of the first, or at least one of the 6 projects that we have within that portfolio. This is, in Q1 of this year, we signed a lease with a hyperscaler and our role in it is essentially we provide the shell of the building and all of the power related infrastructure, and the hyperscaler comes in and provides the rest of the components of the data center. It's a 15-year lease with an escalation, and the reason why we're kind of going after these sites is the hyperscalers, they have a computing requirement that is only increasing in time, and they also have net zero ambitions. So we go and find sites that have near-term grid connections. We need access to water, and we need proximity to the cloud computing hubs. So we essentially go and find these sites, offer them to the hyperscalers, and get them to sign into long-term leases at these projects. But in doing so, we also leverage kind of our green and sustainable credentials, and we look to try and lower the carbon footprint of the buildings during the construction process. So a few ways in which we do this is we target the use of green steel or recycled steel where possible during the construction process. We look for green cement, so cement that's produced in a lower carbon manufacturing process. We also look at green concrete, so we look for low carbon aggregates. And when we're designing the sites, we're responsible for providing the kind of cooling systems, and we will use efficient cooling systems that actually can save up to 85% of the water compared to the average data center. This particular site, as I mentioned, we executed the lease in Q1 2024, and we anticipate the site to be live in Q3 2025, and we'll be receiving lease payments from then on for 15 years. So that's kind of the first site. And on the next slide, you'll see on slide 7, we've got a few more of these within the same campus. So we're anticipating signing another 2 of these sites up with the same hyperscale data center provider within this month, actually. So it's going to be imminent. And those next 2 sites are a similar sort of scale. Each site on its own is in the sort of region of 300 million equity investment. So reasonably large scale investing in these platforms. Beyond this site, beyond these 3, we've got another 3 data centers just more broadly in the US. We've got 2 within Texas and 1 in Wisconsin. And the team's also looking to expand this pipeline beyond these sites as well. So that's the US. So we have a similar kind of strategy of going after kind of long-term contracted revenues in the UK as well, but through a very different kind of technology. Just as a little bit of context, in the UK, we're pushing ahead with our net zero agenda, which means that we're actually retiring a lot of the coal and gas thermal generation. A lot of this traditional generation was driven, it essentially was burnt and drove turbines. Those turbines were spinning, and that was called synchronous generation. They were spinning at 50 hertz. As you retire some of these assets, this synchronous generation, which you see on the chart on the right, you're faced with an issue where you don't have this kind of inertia in the grid. And what does that do? Is it makes frequency more volatile in this country. And we need to keep frequency at 50 hertz or within half a hertz of that. If we don't, then we get blackouts. So a way in which that National Grid are trying to get around this is they're procuring for this inertia. So they're offering contracts up to 10 years for us to go and build solutions that provides more inertia in the grid. And on the next slide is a case study of how we're doing this. So these are two of the sites that we've secured within National Grid's Pathfinder for stability. That's the third phase of the stability Pathfinder that these two sites won contracts in. But this is essentially a 100-year-old technology. It's called a synchronous condenser, and it's just a spinning mass that spins at the same frequency as the grid to replace this kind of retiring thermal spinning that's been lost in the last few years. So it's a simple technology, and we basically just get paid as an availability payment from National Grid for 10 years for just spinning and providing this kind of inertia in the grid. We assume, for the purposes of our investment case, we assume a 25-year asset life on these assets, but in reality, these assets can go a lot longer than that. There are still assets, synchronous condensers, that were built in the 1960s that are operating in Australia. Just to touch on some of the sustainability angles again, these assets, where we can, we try and improve the biodiversity of the sites. The Sellindge project, we have managed to secure an 80% biodiversity uplift on the site through planting like 200% additional hedgerows. So beyond just providing stability to the grid, these are positive for the environment as well. We just, as a quick overview, we acquired the first site, Sellindge, in September 2023. That's going to be online in October 2025. And we acquired the second site, Kilfunneth, in January, and that'll be online in April 2026. So I'll just pass it on to Rosalind.
Picking up on what apologies. Picking up on what Jamie was saying about the biodiversity net gain, you might think that something that weighs 120 tons of steel can't improve the environment, but actually it can. And that's a key way we like to approach our investment in terms of the impact that we can make. We also seek to do the local jobs. And we're very happy to provide case studies for your reporting so that you can actually start to bring to life the broader impact that these projects generate, because we, in our experience, have found this improves returns. We have found that our power usage effectiveness on the sustainable data centres, we're a third of the market average, thanks to the approach of green steel, of green cement, and optimisation of water usage. But to say that we're doing all of these things without any third party marking our homework doesn't necessarily give confidence. So here on slide 10, we are showing all of the various third party affiliates that we work with. We had a UNPRI 5-star assessment across our 3 submitted categories for the most recent submission. We report TCFD emissions. We report scope 1, scope 1, 2, scope 1, 2, 3, so that whatever reporting you need, we can have ours be something that can be lifted and put into your reports to make it as easy as possible. We are also an early adopter of TNFD. So whereas there's the climate-related financial disclosures, there are now also nature-related financial disclosures. And again, we're trying to make this as transparent as possible to you so that you can really start to understand the nature risk, the climate risk in your portfolio. I said earlier that we think we have the leadership, or we are working with these third parties, and on slide 11 there are some nice awards that we have had, which is a little bit more third party validation. But that key point of sustainable investing improving returns. We, for example, at a site over in America, were building the US's largest solar project. And 9 months before the regulations came in on any restrictions of imports from China, we, 9 months ahead of the regulations, required auditability, traceability, and verification of the wafers, the polysilicon that made the wafers, and the silicon that turns into the polysilicon, so we could have as much comfort as possible on that supply. We actually ended up for that project being the anchor order for building a new factory in Mexico. So that gave us some real confidence on the provenance of our panels. Now, all of this does come with a small upfront cost. in a public forum, so I probably shouldn't say the cost, but I can tell you if you ever need. And it was a key value item when we sold the asset. Because when we went to market to sell a 49% stake, it was a gating item for incoming investors. The go, no go, we will not look if you can't show us the provenance. We were able to do the provenance. We had more bidders. More bidders meant more competitive tension. More competitive tension resulted in a better price. That's an approach where we, ahead of regulations, have been showing the impact and considered approach to your sustainability and broader obligations can improve returns. We leverage that learning on a project here in UK. We're building the UK's largest solar project. It's Cleve Hill, the first NSIP for solar. And we used that approach to procurement that we had learned from America. And that became actually, while the UK and the EU do not have these regulations, a gating item in terms of the financing. So again, by being ahead of the curve, we have been able to show that we are actually delivering benefit and value add to our investments. To give you a brief review though on these markets, you asked us earlier about where we are in the US, the UK and Australia. If I turn to slide 12, this has been the year, I believe about 40% of the world has voted, starting early in the year with Russia's elections, and we're now coming to the end. We've had ours, and it's going to America. Everyone is looking to America. Will the Inflation Reduction Act survive a potential second Trump presidency? To this, I would say the first action Donald Trump made in 2016 was to withdraw from the Paris Accord. Big statement. I'm withdrawing from Paris. But he didn't stop investment tax credits. He didn't stop production tax credits. And we, during Trump's presidency, built an onshore wind development platform, which started with initial investment in 2017 and was exited in 2021 for $1 billion to Brookfield. So while there may be big statements, we have found that Donald Trump, when there is good business, allows good business to continue, and he continued to support renewables with things like the investment tax credits and production tax credits. It's a key thing to note when thinking about the US election. Rolling on though to the UK, we've had our election. We are privileged with bipartisan support for renewables. The big debate was 95% low carbon power by 2030 from the Conservatives and 100% low carbon power by 2030 with Labour. Labour has been on acceleration mode, more and more support for renewables. The local to here project Mallard Pass has got its nationally significant approval for its DCO. And up in Lincolnshire, there was a project that was consented just last night. So we are seeing a significant uptick in the approval speed. So consenting was a problem, and now we are seeing the consents rolling through. We are seeing also grid reform to allow better access to grid connection and to remove those projects that were underutilising, squatting on their grid connection offers. All of which I would say is meaning that right now we're able to look at opportunities in and around where we are today to carry on investing in renewables and the energy transition, which is a very exciting opportunity of up to, well, £500 billion of investment to deliver that decarbonised power system.
I think, yeah, just really to wrap it up from our end, thank you, Foz. You know, the Australian market is about 5 years behind, really, from a legislative perspective. You know, where we are in the UK, but Queensland is, well, they've had a Labour government in, I suppose, a year and a half now. So they're starting to push on. Queensland government is very pro-renewables. They've got a strong 80% target by 2035, I think it is. Anyway, there's a great big opportunity in Australia, and it continues to develop and accelerate, especially given the sort of geopolitical shift as well that I mentioned earlier. But look, from an overall summary perspective, the fund is performing how we would like it to perform. You know, perhaps if not slightly better, valuations continue to increase. There's been a good amount of drawdown, as I said, we're at about 64% as we speak, and we're really excited about what's coming next, and incredibly grateful for your support. So thank you.
Well, thanks very much. Really interesting presentation. Appreciated. David.
These good news stories, and I think that the county council should push out to the media, because it shows that we're actually acting as we're speaking. You know, we're not just talking about green energy and all the rest of it. We're actually doing something about it. And we did suggest this at the last meeting, didn't we? We had some good news stories, which I don't think we actually voted very.
Yeah, it is a good news story, Dave. Yeah.
Yeah. Could I ask a specific issue on an issue though? Looking at the UK energy market, this is something that I've taken an interest in. Grid access and congestion continues to be a major obstacle to new projects. I've been concerned for some time that with the growth agenda, whether utility companies are in a position to supply the services that will be needed to service all this lot. We've talked to Severn Trent, and I think they've said, "Oh yes, they're able to cope." But is the problem with electricity not the ability of power stations to meet demand, but the grid itself? Is that am I right? And what exactly can be done to overcome this? I know there's issues about pylons being pushed across Wales and East Anglia. I've been following that. And nobody wants a pylon, but could you? We haven't got a lot of time, but if we could just have a few comments on that situation, I'd appreciate it.
So the UK is facing quite an amazing moment of change, because all bar one of our standing nuclear fleet will be retired by 2030 because of age. The only one that's going to operate, that's currently operating, is Sizewell B, and Hinkley is hopefully going to come online now in about 2030, but has been very delayed. I say also about a third of our standing gas generation will also be retired because of age by 2030. It's not policy, it's just old machines built in the 60s, 70s that have reached the end of life. There will be an opportunity to connect new build onshore wind, solar into those the export points for those retiring plants. But one of the key things we have struggled with is National Grid almost being overwhelmed by applications for new projects to connect, and you didn't have to have very much by way of land or planning in order to submit your application for a connection spot. And we went from maybe say 10 applications a month to tens a week, each of which have to be analysed. And then if you don't need to have land and you don't need to have planning, you can then sit on your grid connection for not much cost. So what's been happening is something called grid connection reform. And under grid connection reform, all future applications must be accompanied by a letter of support saying you have secured the land for your project, which will help. And there's going to be greater cost to maintaining your spot in the queue. We're also moving to something called first ready, first connect, which means that if I say my project's got land, it's got planning, and I'm ready to break ground, there will be an acceleration of our grid queue position. And lastly, we are removing what are called the zombie projects from the grid connection queue. So they have been able to sit, for example, there are nuclear projects that are mothballed by developers, still sat with a grid connection offer. In North Wales, for example, there's one. There are multiple that now you would say in an amnesty have actually handed back their connection, and over about 14% of our current operating fleet in equivalency have said, "Do you know what, we're not going to be able to do anything. We can't develop these projects," and that has allowed others to accelerate too. There will then later on be acceleration of the build out of wires to enable more and more electricity.
Yeah. Is that all right, Mark? Is that okay?
That's fine. Yeah, we can find some stuff.
Yeah, I think, being serious, I think you probably educated us. I had no idea that it was like that, and that's gives some sort of reassurance. So, Hilary, you're next.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you very much, team. It is a fascinating topic for all of us. I declare a slight interest. I have a granddaughter who is a nuclear engineer inspector, sadly in France, because she's not here. But my question is really following on or comment from Mr. Bill, is this thing of the backlog of planning applications that have been approved, one of them in my own district, that can't even start work on preparing because the National Grid cannot take it. And obviously the where it's going to be, they're not going to start spending money on it if they're not going to get any return. Now, I think you mentioned that, well, you did mention that future applications have to have everything in place. But what about the ones that are already approved, have the land, has gone through everything, jumps and everything? I think I'm right in saying, I'm sure someone will correct me, there is at least, well, I know of two, there's at least 2 or 3 in Leicestershire that are stuck. Now, people can lose patience. Also, I'm not entirely sure if the planning approval is on the same level as, for example, any other planning approval. It's time sensitive. And if they haven't started doing something within 3 years, they have to reapply. Now, this is causing more problems, more money being outlaid before any return. So I'd just like, taking on from Mr. Bill, I think this is something that needs to be explained more fully. I'm only a layperson, I don't really understand. All I know is they've got the approval, they've got the land, it's gone through everything, all the residents have agreed to do it, and they keep saying, where is it? Thank you.
So the change that's been happening, and it started about 18 months ago and is really gathering pace, has been the grid connection reform. And where we again have been showing leadership, because we were one of the first countries to experience grid congestion. It's not just the UK, Poland, America starting to experience this. A lot of countries are now experiencing this problem. So the solution has been coming where we have now got government, Ofgem, National Grid, and sort of industry participants such as ourselves all coming together and say we need to make change in how grid connection is managed, how the queue is managed, and how offers are handed out. So there, it is happening. To say that in 18 months we've actually achieved quite a lot with the amnesty and with the move to First Ready, First Connect. The next step is that retrospective treatment of First Ready, First Connect, where there is going to be, or we expect the change that if a project such as the one you say, which has planning and which has land and which has being held back by grid, should now, if that last change comes through, be able to go ahead. And yes, there are many projects that have to start site access works or something to show they have triggered their permit and that they don't have to go back through planning. It's very frustrating.
Yeah, please.
I did appreciate it, and I appreciate where we are, but to my mind, this planning application was approved for it to come on the grounds it would come online in 2025. Now, nothing. Now, I take your point that it will go, but even if it got it now, and they said, yes, National Grid can take it, it's not going to be done in 2025. It then causes an awful lot of problems when sites are started to get over the time limit barrier. That really, really upsets people who just see a building site lying fallow for years because of the planning time limits. So who's working on that, if I may? Thank you.
It's a difficult one, Rosalind. I mean, this is a specific planning application which possibly would be difficult for you to comment on. But I think the sentiment is, you've covered a lot of what is going on to increase the capacity of National Grid, and there's work. But Unless you have powers that I don't know about. Planning is extremely complex and it's difficult. I very much take your point, Hilary. It's noted, and I think you're clearly working hard to get more capacity for entry into the national grid. Now, Mr. Cartwright.
One from me, if I may, Chair, because I think it's quite important. I want to talk about risk. Well done. I congratulate on your battery storage and your data centres and your renewables. But if you'd also mentioned 15 years, which is actually quite important to me, because 15 years ago we stored everything on a floppy disk. 15 years into today, we don't. So my question around the data centres really is about risk. We are on the cusp of AI learning and machine learning, and indeed what we don't know now is what data storage is going to look like in the next 15 years. It certainly isn't going to be the way it is now. It's going to be much more energy efficient, much more capacity from smaller spaces. So the risk question to you is, data centers have evolved over time, and it is going to be a growth business without any shadow of a doubt. But data centers have really reached where they can, unless they're new from the ground up today. But even that probably is wrong in 2, 3, 5 years time, when whatever the next phase of data center storage is. So to simplify it, 15 years ago, floppy disk, we know how that looks now. But equally, what you're investing in, I don't want to detract from the successes, but it's a fragile module going forward because of the investment required to keep up.
Yes, we actually entirely agree with what you're saying, and that's why our strategy is entirely to build the shell of the building and provide the power related infrastructure so that the tenant can come in and build any of the data center requirements that they need. They understand the risks that in 5 years time they might need to take that out, repurpose it, put in new technology. So that's why we've separated our investment from the data center itself and into the shell building with the power related infrastructure to try and ensure we're mitigating against any sort of technology risk.
I think you've been asked some fairly testing questions here. So thanks very much, Mark, Rosalind and James, for an excellent presentation. Just one more question from Roy.
Yeah, you talk about the UK as a market. If you have a UK company doing some international partnership work, would you consider that sort of thing? I'm thinking in particular of one example. There's a British firm laying a cable from, I think, Morocco to try and bring power from a massive solar plant out there. So would that come within the encompass of the sort of things you would look at?
So it's a case that the majority of the earnings need to be cited within the core markets that we work from, but that we wouldn't prevent a company from going and earning revenue that is a great opportunity. But the majority must come from UK, the US and Australia, and that is where they would be headquartered.
Okay, well, once again, thank you very much, Mark, Rosalind and James, for an excellent presentation and for answering some fairly tricky questions. You haven't got the ability to see into the future, but maybe next time you come, you'll have acquired that.
Thank you very much for having us. Really appreciate your support.
Yeah, appreciate it.
All the best.
Right, well, I had a request for a 5-minute comfort break, so we'll meet back here at just past 1:45. So literally 5 minutes. Okay. Okay, so if we can recommence, that that would be appreciated.
Then
Yeah. Okay, so we'll restart the meeting, and we've noted item 7. Is that agreed? Yeah, thank you. So the next item is item 11, which is the risk management and internal controls. We're going to take that as read and go straight over to questions. So does anyone have any comments or questions on the report? Okay. If they don't, in which case the committee has been asked to note the report and approve the revised pension fund risk register. I'm happy to move the recommendation. Can I have a seconder? All in favour? Yeah, we've done quite a lot on risk today, actually. So, yeah, I think all the variables are covered within there. That's great. So we're now on to item 15, which is the draft pension fund annual report and accounts, pages 351 to 462. Bullish, over to you to present the report.
Thank you, Chair. Again, I'll be brief. There's only a couple of main points here. So the purpose is to seek the committee's approval of the appended annual report and accounts of the pension fund for the financial year ending 23-24. The accounts are in the process of being audited, and the board and committee will be updated at the earliest opportunity on the opinion given by the auditor once this has been completed. At point 4, you can see in May 2024, the Scheme Advisory Board, SAB, SIPFA, the Public Finance Accountants body, and dealer produced revised guidance for the preparation of annual reports. At point 6, you can see the guidance that they revised gave you some options. There was a must section, a should section, and a may section. May being compliance is recommended but discretionary. The other two is anticipated but is discretionary, and obviously the must is you must do now. At point 8, we've highlighted three areas where non-compliance exists. In the middle of those 3 bullet points, funds must report investment performance net of fees for the 12 months corresponding to the accounting period for each fund manager or asset class, must be reported alongside an appropriate benchmark. Now, we do all of the bits that it says there, the net of fees, the 12 months for the accounting period, but we can't display the benchmark in our annual report. And it's a condition of the contract that we have with our provider for these benchmarks, which we'll be working on with them over the next 12 months so we can get past that one hurdle. But other than that, nothing else to say for that. Thanks.
Thank you, Bullish. Does anyone have any comments or queries, or we're happy to accept that? So if nobody has any comments or queries, the committee's been asked to approve the annual report and accounts for the pension fund for the financial year 23-24, subject to external audit. Is that agreed? Yeah. Note that the Corporate Governance Committee will receive the external audit of the 23-24 Leicestershire County Council Statement of Accounts, Annual Governance Statement and Pension Fund Accounts. Is that agreed? Thank you. So that's item 15. So we're now going to return to item 6, which is the local government pension scheme current developments update. Now, we all know we had a change of government in July. There has been quite a lot of cross-party agreement and moving forward. We know that the Chancellor is keen to utilise pension funds in some way to kickstart economic growth in the economy. Our pension fund is quite well invested within the UK economy, but I'll just refer to Kat. Kat knows a lot more about this than I do, so over to you, Kat.
Thanks, Chair. Yeah, as you say, this is kind of just an update on the current developments following the local election. And then the report also has some further sections on areas which remain from the previous government that we're still waiting for clarification on. So I'll kind of just quickly go through, but obviously we can take questions. So On 20th July, the Chancellor set out kind of the announcement about unleashing the full investment minds of the LGPS to make it an engine for UK growth. This followed on from a letter from a previous local government minister before the general election that related to asking funds to respond to a number of questions on pension asset pooling, how funds ensure they run efficiently, and whether they have appropriate governance structures in place. The fund responded to that, and that's attached as Appendix B. At the time, there's a recognition that even with the general election, as Chair said, there was quite strong cross-party support for pooling. So with the new Chancellor's announcement, part of the what was referenced was that they will consider legislating to mandate pooling if insufficient is made by March 2025. Not yet clear what could be considered insufficient progress. However, the previous government had referenced a deadline of 31st of March 2025 for the transition of listed assets from funds to pools. So from Leicestershire's perspective, I'm sure most members are aware, we have about £1 billion in low-cost passive equity funds with LGIM. The fund has always considered those pooled. However, they are outside LGPS Central, but they were procured with other local authorities. If we add that to the amount that the fund has pooled of 40%, that would equate to around 57% fund total fund assets. And then when you look at that in the years ahead with all of the commitments that have been made through the investment subcommittee that are due to be invested, then by about 2028, with the kind of current trajectory, we should be about 70% funded. Pooled, sorry. Part of the kind of drive from government seems to be inspiration from the Canadian pension funds. So these are kind of large funds that have a portion of in-house management. They also have diversified assets, which tend to focus more on private markets, as well as a focus on long-term value creation. I know there's been, I think, debates at committee in the past, and there's kind of a lot of pros and cons that people might kind of argue about pooling and consolidation, but I suppose ultimately for the fund, it could lead to greater economies of scale and fee savings, but that has to be managed appropriately. And it's clear from government's perspective that the drive seems to be about encouraging that further pension investment into UK assets to ultimately boost growth. So the next kind of area is on fees. So part of the Chancellor's announcement referenced an increase of fees of 70% since 2017, and whether further consolidation could help with this. The increase in fees is kind of interesting to look at reasons behind that. Obviously, it's not just increase in management fees, but it's as a result of the increase in asset management across the fund. So that obviously leads to an increase in fees due to them being paid as a percentage of assets under management. Funds like Leicestershire have also increased their investment in private markets, so assets that are kind of more management intensive, so like forestry and infrastructure, which kind of cost more than those traditional listed equity investments. The report kind of sets out the funds increased in cost since 2019, but it's interesting to note on Wednesday, government came out with a call for evidence, which obviously it's a bit late for inclusion in this report, but that call for evidence on further information from funds spoke about UK investment, but focused more on that UK investments and returns rather than potential impact of any costs. So obviously that brings me on to my next section on the UK investments, which was formerly termed the levelling up, with the previous government wanted funds to invest up to or 5% or over into levelling up ambitions. Obviously, government has removed the term levelling up from their kind of terminology, but the report sets out kind of the fund's current status in its UK assets. So, and that's part of that call for evidence, where I think they want to see where the funds can drive that increased investment. But when you look at the fund's investments versus kind of the market benchmark, the fund looks really favourable. So the fund has about 12% of its assets in UK markets. So we'll just kind of need to wait to see what the new guidance from government is on where it's looking to encourage investment growth. So some of the other areas which kind of remain from the previous government. So we have the LGPS Good Governance Project. The fund has been kind of progressing that along for a number of years since the final report was published, but they're still kind of waiting for some work from government to kind of legislate or put that into the appropriate kind of guidance for funds. So we'll wait on that, but the funds has definitely followed best practice in that regard. We also have the TCFD reporting, and I know I say this, I think, most meetings, but we're still waiting for government's guidance on how funds should report on climate-related risks in line with the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures requirements. The fund still has its reporting, so we reported in June this year. And then it's also worth noting that in government's manifesto, they referenced wanting funds and financial institutions and UK-based companies developing and implementing credible transition plans that align with the 1.5 degree goal of the Paris Agreement. So essentially, they want to require funds to set out a transition plan to reach net zero by 2050. This is obviously in line with the pension fund's own net zero ambition, but we'll have to wait to see, I suppose, what develops out of that. And obviously, we'll be looking at reviewing the net zero climate strategy of the fund in the next year or so. So we'll obviously be able to take that into account through that. Some of the areas around fiduciary duty and climate change, members had a briefing from the head of law about a few months ago, so I won't touch on that. But I'll probably just leave it there if members have any questions.
Thanks, Kat. I think that's a fairly good summary. And to summarise even further, until it becomes clear that there's been this call for evidence, the report outlines all the possibilities, but clearly the government, and it was cross-party, was interested in making more efficiency. They declared they want investment within the UK and they want to increase performance by investing in the UK. Well, our principal duty is to make sure that we can pay the pensions and that we don't suffer because of any government legislation. I would like to think that they will take a sensible approach because the number of people employed in the local government pension scheme is substantial, and if they start damaging that, they're going to create massive problems. So hopefully a sensible approach will be taken. It's not easy, and there's talked about merging of funds and all sorts of things, and the fees. And as Kat said, the assets under management have gone up, therefore the fees have gone up. The private markets and the private debt markets take a hell of a lot more managing, and hence there are bigger fees. But look, fairly straightforward, clear report, and the end result is we know what we have known knowns and known unknowns, to coin that well-known phrase. And until we know the unknowns, we can't really say an awful lot more. But if anybody has any questions, please put your hand up. Yeah, Roy.
More an observation, really. It does worry me that there'll be a big temptation down the road for the government to micromanage everything and to tell us where, in what sectors, etc., we have to invest.
Yeah.
And that is of great concern, really.
Yeah, I absolutely agree, Roy. I think unless they're going to underwrite it, they have to leave the management of the fund to our advisors and to the committee. Declan.
Just to underline that point, really, and this has obviously bubbled around for a while, and ironically, the Treasury is kind of our greatest ally on this because they don't want to underwrite LGPS. So the Treasury traditionally has pushed back against government getting too much interference. Whether they'll hold that line or not will be interesting, but they are an unusual ally at the moment.
Yeah, well, unlikely so. And I think a common sense approach. We can't just use the pension fund as a kitty to implement the PEP projects of any government, of any political persuasion. Our job is to make sure we can pay the pensions. Look, if there are no other questions. Oh, right, Bipple.
I think this is a bit more of an unknown sort of question again, but I think from the things that I've been seeing, there's not only changes to encourage more pooling, but there's also changes to the pooling arrangements. From my understanding of where we sit with Central is one of the bigger pooled funds. So there wouldn't be too much of an impact with that if there's a likelihood of sort of there being less pools, but just bigger ones. Yeah, just to clarify our position there.
Yeah, I'll respond to that. That's okay.
Thank you.
At this point, there's no knowns around this, but merging pools is a lot harder than merging funds, is what we've heard. From a legal perspective alone. So, but you're right. LGPS Central is one of the larger pools. Yeah.
So, sorry, just on that, I think even Central would have to take in other partners. I think it'd be the issue. So it's more like you'd have people joining as opposed to it necessarily being broken up. But the other thing that's been floating around is actually whether you actually merge individual kind of local authority funds as well. So this committee could grow in terms of other ones. But there's an awful lot of talk, but as Bush said, there's no kind of actual meat on the bones of any of this at the moment.
Okay, thanks, Declan.
Just a very quick one. Echo the comments. I do have concerns about this, and being forced down the line of government to maybe invest into government projects that do take a long time, always go over budget, and not good for our pensioners. So I think we just need to keep an eye on this one.
I think we're all the same mind on that. Yeah. Look, if there are no other questions, we're asked to note this report. Is that agreed? Thank you. So the next item we've got is item 9, which is the pension fund budget monitoring update, which is outlined on pages 97 to 102 of the agenda. So Bullish, you're presenting this, so over to you.
Thank you, Chair. So purpose, like you said, is to update the local pension committee on the fund's budget and forecast for 2024 and 2025 and for future years. So for background, the fund's budget and business plan were presented to the local pension board for consideration on the 7th of February and to the local pension committee on the 8th of March. This report now provides an update to that budget that was presented for this year. I'd like to move on to the table, which is at point 7, and we'll just talk around that because there's a lot of numbers in there, and at first glance it looks like quite complicated. So let's break it down into a number of areas. What you've got in that second column there is the budget from last year. Next to it, the actuals from last year, and then the budget for this year is in the fourth column. That budget for this year, 24-25, was set before we knew what the outturn for the actuals were. So you'll note that there's a difference between what we think we're going to spend on the budget this year. So if you look at that row which is titled subtotal 44.6 million, we think we're going to end up spending closer to 50 million. You can see 49.9, and there's a number of reasons for that. One, we didn't know the actual outturn was. Secondly, we've got higher funds under management, and as Kat mentioned earlier, that management fees are a function are a percentage of your assets under management. So if your fund grows, you will end up paying more in pounds fees. Secondly, as we transition from public markets, so you'll note over time we've been reducing our listed equity exposure and we're moving more towards private markets. So think of things like infrastructure, private debt, timberland even. They all attract fees which are multiple times higher than listed equity. Think of passive listed equity at something at less than 10 basis points. So that's 1/10 of 1%. Private markets, multiple times more, 50, 60, 70, 80 basis points. As we move into those asset classes, we'll incur transaction costs. You can see that in the table there. Last year, we incurred about £13 million, and we'll also be exposed to performance fees. Private markets typically have performance fees attached. Think of things like 20% performance fees once you reach a hurdle of 8%. So those two elements make it quite variable and volatile. Last year, for example, we'd invested an amount of money into direct property, and that comes with stamp duty, and that you'll see that within the transaction cost. So part of that £13 million is stamp duty. One of the things to also bear in mind is that the total cost is borne out of the fund. So if the fund does well, we'll pay higher fees, but it's borne from the fund. Any other points on there I'd probably mention is you've got that row in the middle, LGPS central costs. They're gradually increasing over time, but we have got this year where we expect to spend a little bit less than we did when we first set the budget. You can see there 1,298 million, so 1.3 million was expected. We'll probably spend a bit less than that as it stands. The 4 rows underneath that, staffing, IT, actuarial and support, refer to our administering authority costs. So the team that Ian Howe looks after. In total, I'd probably summarise to say we've built in as much as we can into the future years, so 25, 26 and 26, 27 based on what we know now, but those numbers can be hugely volatile. For example, we've stuck in 10-ish million or 11 million for performance fees, but get a good couple of years and that could easily be 50% bigger. Happy to take any questions.
Yep. Thanks very much, Bhulesh. And again, the report is fairly clear and any points have been raised by Bhulesh. If there are any questions, Clive.
Just a quick one. Why is the actuarial costs 400k in 25, 26 when prior year it's 150?
Good question. So we run on a 3-year cycle for the actuarial. So you'll notice that every 3 years we'll have a bump up. So there's a lot more work for these guys to do and therefore costs.
Okay, so every 3 years.
Yeah. Okay, so every 3 years. Yeah. Okay, Roy.
Yeah, the actuals for last year are obviously very helpful when you're looking at the budgets, but last year's budget's historic and really has little relevance now to me. And I think it clouds the picture when you're looking at a complicated set of tables like that.
You mean the 23-24 budget? Yeah, I mean, we could have left that off, but for transparency, we left it on, that's all.
Thanks very much. So at least it shows where we were last year, gives a bit of a historic perspective, but yeah, I take your point, Roy. Any other questions? No. So the committee has been asked to note the report and note the increased forecast for the current and future years. Is that agreed? That's agreed. Thank you. That's unanimous. So the next item is a summary evaluation of the pension fund as outlined on pages 103 to 122 of the agenda. So we're working it hard this morning, Bhulesh. It's over to you again.
Thank you, Chair. So this is our standard quarterly report and usually focuses around performance of the pension fund, but we've always added a few extra points. So we've got market performance and outlook. We've got portfolio changes in the quarter just ended, listed equity reorganisation, cash outstanding and cash and outstanding commitments, and we've got a piece on a particular fund with the LGPS Central we'll talk about, and then finally the overall fund performance. So first part of that, market performance. Markets were generally good in the second quarter, although not as strong as they were in the first quarter, which was a plus 8.2% for global equity, which was probably which was the strongest year since 2019. Of the global markets, US equities rose over the quarter and outperformed global equities. The S&P 500 and the Nasdaq both reached new highs. And just for a little while, Nvidia reached 3 trillion in market cap and was once the most valuable company in the world. UK equities also, judged by the FTSE, the Financial Times Stock Exchange 100, hitting new all-time highs as well. The market in the UK was supported by CPI inflation declining to about 2%. We saw that on the graphs earlier that Hyman's presented also. And we've had a little tick up through July, but it's the lowest numbers we've had since July 21. However, European shares were lower in the quarter. The ECB, European Central Bank, went ahead with its first rate cut in June. 25 basis points dropped to 3.75, became the first major central bank to do so. And the Bank of England has since reduced its rates by 0.25% down to 5%. The Fed is due to meet later in September, and most commentators are looking at anywhere between a 25 and 50 basis points cut there. We've got a couple of graphs on page 104, so I'll quickly talk about those. And they're the graphs from Hyman's Robertson's Capital Markets Review, which is appended to this report. They see growth as solid but unspectacular going forward. You'll note that on that that graph there at the top of 104, the dots kind of coalesce around at 1.5% GDP growth year on year through 2025. These kind of forecasts have been poor in the past. You know, you'll see graphs by central banks, for example, all underperforming what the banks thought they would. But this is the guide for the future: 1.5% they reckon into 2025 for the developed economies. There's another graph there at underneath 0.8, which kind of shows that global equity markets are valued at the high end of historical standards. So this is a kind of warning to say, don't expect, you know, growth to continue in the same manner. So you can see here what you're paying for here. You'll notice the graph, the horizontal axis shows a price earnings metric. So that's telling you for every pound of earnings how many pounds you have to pay. So at the minute it's around £25, which is historically quite high. We've also got our standard table over at page 11, which shows for various asset classes over 3 months all the way out to 20 years. No real change there. It's showing the same kind of picture for those asset classes. Any questions before I break to the next section here?
Anybody got any questions? Mr. Cartwright?
Just one, really. Thank you, Bernice. In relation to NVIDIA, you mentioned the positive side of it, but there's been a steady decline in the growth. I expect over 2024, 2025 actually to steady out, but there is some serious concern around the share price of NVIDIA at the moment.
Yeah, I suppose we don't invest in single stocks as such. I suppose the case that we're trying to make is we're relatively careful in terms of positioning, and we check once a year with Hyman's, the investment team, and we bring a strategy to the committee for approval. We don't invest, like I say, in individual stocks per se. Managers take those decisions on our behalf, but we have been reducing our equity weighting over time. We're probably recognising the fact that as the fund gets bigger and is better funded, we need to take less risk.
Thanks, Bullish. I think, am I right in we actually targeted to reduce our equity investments, didn't we? And we're still in the process of doing that.
And we're still doing that, and we'll certainly come on to that later in the pack as well.
Roy.
Yeah, we've got a wage spiral starting, and I can't help but feel inflation's going to be higher than seemed to be anticipated earlier in the meeting, which is a concern. And we are trying to reduce the risk profile. So we were advised earlier that our 75% prudence might not be sufficient, and I think we should be seriously considering lifting that figure.
Thanks, Roy. There's so many variables. You know, although we say we're 150% funded, there are so many risks out there that any one of them could actually change things. Declan.
And the key thing always to remember is we are in the luxurious position of being a very long-term kind of sort of participant in the market. So these blips tend to be just bumps in the road unless there's something really significant. So when they do the sort of the triennial sort of valuation, they will look at all those different funding scenarios. It takes into account higher interest rates, etc. So you can get that balanced view. But I suppose just bear in mind, 75% is pretty prudent. It's saying that kind of 3/4 of the time we're going to beat our expectations that our funding plan's based on, compared to a quarter would be low. But you're right, it's kind of the more volatility and uncertainty out there, the more prudent a stance that you want to take.
Thanks, Declan. So if we have no other questions, have we got any other questions?
No, I've got
Bullish.
Yeah, I've got a bit more.
All right.
I'm at point 12.
Trying to rush you, Bullish, sorry.
I'm at point 12. So if there's no other questions on the previous parts, I'll move to point 12, which is changes in the quarter. There were three main changes in the quarter. So the central multi-asset credit fund, we added 55 million to that, and that's trying to bring us towards the 9% target weight for that fund. And there's more on that later in the paper. The central emerging market debt fund was divested in total in two equal divestments, totaling about 120 million. The rationale behind that was that we've got emerging market debt exposure within the multi-asset credit fund. So it's simplifying our fund a little. And the third one there is Stafford's Carbon Offset Opportunity Fund. So that's the Timberland Fund, made its first call of about £7 million. And that was an investment that was approved by the ISC in the summer of 2022. overall, the net effect on cash in the course has been a small increase. So we've gone up from 386 million to about 417 in total. The third item, the listed equity reorganisation update. So as the chair mentioned earlier, we're dropping our listed equity holdings over time. A little recap there is October 2023, the ISC received an update on the listed equity transition, which it approved earlier in the year in April 2023. The summary was a decision to reorganise the listed equity holdings and reduce total fund weight to 37.5%. So that's 37.5% that will be within listed equity across the two managers, LGPS Central and Legal and General. We appointed a transition advisor to help us do this, and they described a 4-phase plan to reorganise and reduce the listed equity exposure down to 37.5%. First, phase 1 of that plan was completed just about a year ago in September 23, and that was reducing the LGPS Central Multi-Factor Climate Fund holding to 12%. That sent £220 million back to the fund in cash. Phase 2 was the reorganisation of Legal and General's passive holdings. So we had a fairly complicated list there. So we had single stocks that we held there. We held a number of geographical funds there, and they were all collapsed into just 3 funds in November 2023. So we have a UK fund there now. We have an all-world fund, which obviously invests across the world, and we have a low carbon transition fund with LGIM. And that's significantly simplified our holdings from what we had previously with LGIM, which was over 10 separate funds. Phases 3 and 4, the divestment of the Central Emerging Market Fund, we just talked about. Central Emerging Market Fund, we divested. That happened in July 2024. The investment also of £120 million additional into the Global Equity Fund happened in July also. So just to summarise that, the Global Equity Fund, we added 120, Global Emerging Markets, we took 190 out. And that was phases 3 and 4 of that. The last part to get us down to 37.5% of total fund assets is to reduce our LGIM all-world holdings down to 12%, which would get us down to 37.5%. But given we're holding so much cash at the minute, we're holding back on reducing that, which would then also add even more cash. We've got nowhere to kind of invest it at the minute. All the commitments we've made to private markets just in the process of being called. We've got in excess of £700 million of commitments out there in the market at the minute. We're holding £400 million worth of cash, so we can manage that in the short term at least. The fourth item is cash holdings and outstanding commitments. I just mentioned that we hold quite a lot of cash at the minute. They're just taking longer to call by the managers than we'd expect. On top of that, we've got another £100 million to that 700 million, which was committed after the 30th of June. And we also have another 280 million approved by the ISC last year, which we will commit once a relevant product becomes available at LGPS Central relating to private debt. We think we'll be around £400 million in cash by the end of the calendar year, but it's hugely dependent on the speed of the commitments being called by the managers and whether or not we reduce our listed equity holdings with advice from our investment advisor down to that 37.5. Before I move on to the LGPS Central's MAC fund update, any questions on the cash part?
Roy?
Not so much cash, but you talked about the all world holdings. Is that ex-UK, or is the UK included within that? Yeah, that means we don't really have a feel for how much we've got invested in the UK, doesn't it?
We've got a piece within our annual report that highlights and breaks down how much we have invested in the UK. I think we've also got something on the earlier paper. Just see if we can get it on screen. And we've got we've got 253 million in listed equity, but overall, including government bonds, infrastructure, and private equity, we've got 764, which is about 12% of the fund. And that table was a table that was required as part of the annual report. But on top of that, we also have monies within UK property as well, which would add another 5%. So we're probably talking closer to 20%.
Thanks, Bulash. If we have no other questions, then I'll just carry on to the next bit, please, Bullosh.
This fifth item is relating in particular to LGPS Central's multi-asset credit fund. So I mentioned earlier how this fund has a target weight of 9% of the fund, and at the June snapshot we were at 6.3%, so we're about 170 million short. We've been adding to it consistently through the year over time. We had a 55 million investment planned in July, which we've paused at the minute alongside some of the other ones through the year. Points 26 and 27 talk about the rationale behind that. There is an investigation at one of the managers that manages that. Now, although the manager in question doesn't have anything to do with our fund, the investigations are ongoing, and we thought it would be prudent at this point to just pause it to understand further what's actually happened before we continue with that. And any updates to that position will be brought to the next committee scheduled in November 24. Sixth item is overall investment performance of the fund, ending the 30th of June 24. So if we go over to point 33, before we just talk about the actual performance, we've been adjusting our benchmarks through the year. So point 33 is a reminder about which benchmarks we've been adjusting. And what it's done effectively is trying to balance the risk that we're taking for a fund. So take private equity, for example. Its previous benchmark was the FTSE All World Index, which is a listed benchmark. In reality, private equity takes a bit more risk, and therefore we should be allocating a benchmark to it, which is a bit harder. So what we've done is we've for private equity, for example, we've said it should be FTSE All World plus another 3% every year. We've done that for the Climate Multi-Factor Fund. We've adjusted there, and we've also done it for the infrastructure funds, where we've gone from cash plus 4 to an absolute 8. Now, these changes were a proposal that Hymans Robertson made at the January committee, so we're working through those as we get through the year, and at the next committee we'll work through a few more, and we'll bring those to you to see which ones we've changed in the quarter. 34 talks about the whole fund's returns versus the benchmark. Shorter term, it was a plus 1.7% quarter, was 0.6 behind the benchmark, so the benchmark would have been 2.3. Over the longer terms, you can see the 3 and the 5, we're largely in line with the benchmarks, and those benchmarks have been adjusted to be slightly harder in some cases, as described earlier. We've got a fairly, I wouldn't say fairly long, so we've got a section that talks about LGIM's performance, and we've got a section that talks about the 2 targeted return managers. I'm happy to take questions on those. I don't think I should read those out in full. There's quite a lot to read there. So we've got 38 and 39, which talks about LGIM's passive performance, and we've got 40 to 46, which talks about Ruffer and Fulcrum's performance, and also their strategy, given it's, you know, the Fulcrum strategy is relatively new to the committee.
Okay, so thank you very much, Bullosh. Has anybody got any further questions on this report? No? Okay, so the committee is asked to note the report. Is that agreed? Yep, thank you. So we now move on to item 12, as outlined on pages 135 to 152. So, Kat, over to you, please, to present the report.
Thanks, Chair. So, yeah, of course, this is our normal quarterly responsible investment report. So I'll kind of just briefly go over some of the proposed metrics for the climate risk management report, which is due to come to committee at the next meeting in November, and then kind of a general update on our kind of quarterly voting and stewardship activities. So on the RI plan, so as members might remember, I think it was back in January, committee agreed that we would recirculate the 2023 climate risk management report, and then we would have feedback from members on where we can improve and where we could kind of address some concerns about lack of clarity or transparency. I had some feedback from members, so really grateful for time that was kind of spent there, and of course welcome any comments on what's in front of you today, which we can kind of feed into November's report. So we've had our initial meetings with LGPS Central, who produce the reports for us. So we've let them know kind of the thoughts and comments of committee, and we've started and they've started the data collection process so we can have the report ready. Some of the kind of key areas that we've asked them to focus on is to bring back an area related stewardship plan companies within the climate risk management itself. I don't know if members have been on the committee for a few years. They remember the climate risk management report used to have kind of a big section on stewardship activities of some of our kind of more carbon intensive companies. We'll bring that back to bring a bit more colour, and hopefully we can show where companies are making real world emissions reductions or where we're not happy with how they've been kind of acting in the past years. We're also going to look to make the report a bit more concise for ease of use. I know they're quite lengthy. And then we're also going to expand the asset classes that we include. So we can only do this. So if members remember, we do our listed equity. We have our targeted return and a bit of fixed income. On the central side, they're going to be able to provide more data on their private markets, so, as well as sovereign holdings, which kind of have a bit of difficulty due to how sovereigns report on their climate emissions. But that should bring a bit more colour and kind of get us over that 50% of our assets threshold that we're actually reporting against. The point 12 talks about some of the metrics that we're going to include, as well as kind of some of the difficulties around the metrics as we've previously been using them. So, for example, members might remember on our fossil fuel reserve metrics, as well as our climate solution metrics, these are based on whether companies have at least £1 in kind of either of those areas. So they're quite an overestimation on how much those measures kind of report on how much fossil fuel reserves we have or how much climate solutions we have. So we're going to have a bit more commentary about that within the November report as well. I don't know if members have any comments on there before I go on to voting specifically.
So a very comprehensive report, and I think we can all see that more and more focus is coming on climate change and various other aspects, and that there's no doubt at all that we are making progress. And there is still a lot to do, but if nobody has any questions on that, then we'll move on to the next part then.
Okay, cool. So voting, past quarter is probably one of the most intensive voting periods across the year. So most European companies have their annual general meetings. I think previously members have asked for a bit more kind of colour on what's kind of going on more broadly. So there's been an increase in anti-environmental, social and governance proposals. These largely relate to social factors, although there's also the fact that anti-environmental proposals have doubled over the past year or past few years. Despite this increase in proposals, the support for these proposals has decreased, which is good to see. And while pro-ESG proposals have seen better support than the anti-ESG proposals, those have also kind of declined slightly, and it kind of seems like investors are able to back pro-ESG proposals more where they feel there's kind of more ability for a company to make those changes, and they're not making binding decisions which might affect a company without kind of meaning to. So we get a number of voting alerts from the local authority pension fund forum. We send those to our managers and ask them to consider these where they can. We've seen quite a lot of alignment with that, so about 95% of these votes we've seen alignment through LGS Central and LGIM. I've brought out a little bit of commentary of some of our stewardship plan companies and kind of where there's alignment. You might note on Shell, for example, so Central and LGIM voted against Shell's energy transition, and 22% of shareholders also opposed that in line with a LAPF recommendation. What LGIM and Central didn't do is they didn't vote in line with a shareholder resolution, which basically was in relation to Scope 3 emissions. And both Central and LGIM have kind of fed back why they didn't feel that was appropriate at this point, even though they are supportive of Shell doing more on its energy transition. And then there's a bit of commentary on Exxon. It was referenced at the last meeting. So Exxon tried to kind of bring a legal action against 2 activist investors. Ultimately, that's fallen. So that was good to see, and hopefully Exxon have kind of learnt from that. But it was interesting at the AGM itself, there was also an anti-ESG proposal, and Exxon did also oppose that. So it's not as if they're kind of totally against ESG factors. There's a few examples of specific engagements from our managers, and then a few examples of current developments. So the stewardship code is in development on its revision, and then LATF also issues some recommendations for UK climate policy, which is linked, but I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Kat, for a comprehensive report. Does anybody have any comments or questions? No? Right, so the committee has been asked to note the report. Is that agreed? Thank you. So the next item is the Local Pension Board Annual Report 23-24 on pages 153 to 164. We're going to take this as read unless anybody has any questions on that. No? So the committee again has been asked to note that report. Item 14 is the Pension Regulators Code of Practice on pages 165 to 350. Stuart, you've waited very patiently, so your moment has come.
Thank you, Chair. Morning, everyone. The purpose of this report is to summarise Fund Officer's initial view of our compliance in respect of the Pension Regulators General Code of Practice. And in March 2024, the Pension Regulator combined various codes of practice already in existence into one single General Code of Practice, which is applicable to most public and private occupational pension schemes, including the LGPS. And the code itself can be found in Appendix A. For this assessment, the code has been broken into 15 different categories. And within each of these categories, there are several different criteria, each with their own requirements. We used a compliance tracker tool to go through the 136 different areas that have been identified for assessment. And these requirements were classed as either a regulatory requirement, a TPR, pension regulator expectation, or best practice. And we've concluded that there are 93 areas where we are fully compliant, leaving 40 partially compliant areas, 2 non-compliant areas, and 1 area that doesn't apply to us. It's worth pointing out that where we say partially compliant, perhaps a fairer description would be nearly compliant with these areas. And one of the areas of non-compliance has since been addressed, and we've put together a document which is ready to be signed off to implement that change. The areas that we've identified as partially compliant or non-compliant can be found in Appendix B. And we've noted that some areas of partial compliance are linked, and the completion of a single action may result in full compliance in multiple areas. For example, the creation of an internal controls document, which is mentioned several times throughout the Code of Practice. So the next steps now is to address those areas. We will give priority to the areas that are classed as regulatory requirements. There are 12 regulatory requirements where we're partially compliant, although we've managed to whittle that down to 10 so far. So responsibility for working through this project has been allocated to various officers within the pension section, plus democratic services and investments as well. So there are several key areas that need to be addressed. We go on to talk about which ones they are, but there's this creation of an internal controls document. So we've got all the controls in place that we need. It's just pulling together this document to make it quite explicit for any assessment should the pension regulator wish to come knocking. There's also a transfers guide, which again pulls together documentation that we already have, so we can put that all in one place and update it to make references to the McLeod remedy that came in last year. We need to make some tweaks to the cyber policy to reach full compliance, and then there's a couple of areas: data improvement plan and breaches of law, where we just need to review what we've got in there and just refresh the documentation around that. And the aim is to complete this exercise and be as fully compliant in as many areas as possible by the 31st of March 2025. Concentrating on those regulatory requirements with the aim to get those in place by the end of October, and then move on to the remaining areas between November and March. And we have shared this report with internal audit, and an initial audit to confirm the findings within this report is currently underway. So a final update on the position will be presented to the committee after March 2025.
Thanks very much, Stuart. I mean, it's a very clear report, and I take on board what you're saying about the non-compliant areas, and there's an overlap between some of the non-compliant areas which can be solved by one action. Yeah, it's obviously important. In March 2025, we'll have an update, and hopefully we'll have made a lot of progress. There's no overriding risk that it's like a black swan event. Internal auditor on it, and I would suggest sharing a report like this with internal audit is suicidal, but I just no, they will look at it as well, but it is quite complicated, complex, and the legislation trying to comply with it is very involved. So thank you very much, Stuart. If nobody else, yes, Clive.
Just briefly, when an internal audit carrying out their audit?
Well, there's an initial audit just to make sure they agree with the areas where we say we're fully compliant. So that's ongoing at the moment.
Great, good. Okay, yeah, so make sure it's done before.
Yeah. So it almost double check, really, isn't it? It is. So has anybody else got any questions or queries for Stuart? No? Okay, so committee is asked, as I say, we'll get a report back after March 2025, exactly what progress it made and what is outstanding and what's not outstanding. So the committee is asked to note this report. Is that agreed? Thank you. So the next item is the members are asked to note the dates of future committee meetings and annual general fund for the meeting. So you have them going up to December 2025. That's can I take those dates as noted? Yeah, agreed. Fine. Any other items the chair has decided to take as urgent? There are none. So we now come to the exclusion of the press and public. I move that the public be excluded during consideration of the remaining items in accordance with section 100A subsection 4 of the Local Government Act 72 exempt information. Is that agreed? Thank you. That brings us to the end of the public part of the meeting. The live stream is now ending.